We're very grateful that Paul Fletcher has returned to the Sydney Institute. We're going to have him last year, but we had to postpone for obvious reasons. So I'll introduce the Minister very briefly. Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. And Mr. Fletcher is going to talk for us today on why do we fund the arts. Minister, off you go.
Well, thank you, Gerard. It's a pleasure to once again address the Sydney Institute. And as Minister for the Arts, tonight I want to address the question, why do we fund the arts? There are plenty of myths spread about this issue. One being that the coalition government funds the arts less generously than our political opponents. In fact, coalition governments have consistently been strong supporters of the arts, as I will point out in the first part of my remarks tonight, while also touching on the reasons for that support. Next, I'll talk about the challenges which COVID has created for the arts sector and how the Morrison government has responded. And in the last part of my remarks, I'll discuss our priorities for the arts sector. The Morrison government wants the arts to be for everyone, not for an elite group of people wearing black tie going to opening nights in our big cities. We also have a strong focus on the economic importance of the arts. And these themes have underpinned the actions I've taken as Arts Minister since coming into the portfolio. And I'm pleased to say I've had strong support from the many friends of the arts across the coalition, including the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. Well, let me turn firstly then to the strong history of the Liberal and National parties in supporting arts and culture in Australia. Much of today's arts landscape, for example, goes back to decisions in the 1960s and 70s. Robert Menzies was the driving force behind the establishment of the National Library of Australia, laying its foundation stone in 1966. Harold Holt, in November 1967, committed that his government would build on Menzies' proposal for a National Gallery of Art. And Holt also established a national funding body for the arts, which ultimately became the Australia Council. John Gordon worked to foster an independent film production sector in Australia, establishing what became known as the Australian Film, Television and Radio School in legislation passed in 1972. The Howard government too took significant measures to foster arts and culture, committing to the National Museum of Australia, which opened in 2001, and the National Portrait Gallery, which opened in 2008. As then Arts Minister George Brandis observed in a speech in 2007, quotes, "The two most significant public buildings commissioned in the lifetime of this government are both art galleries," close quotes. Well, that strong support has continued under this current Liberal National government. Business as usual funding for the arts from the Morrison government stands at around $750 million a year. This includes around $215 million allocated through the Australia Council, $260 million for our national collecting institutions, the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, the National Museum, the National Film and Sound Archive, the National Maritime Museum, the National Library and Bundanon, and $80 million allocated through Screen Australia. All of this is before our very substantial support for the arts and entertainment sector in responding to the COVID-driven downturn, which I'll speak more about in a moment. What then has been the rationale for Liberal and National governments to support the arts so strongly? Let me suggest four. First, of course, is the inherent value of creative and cultural endeavour. To write, to paint, to play music, to act, to tell stories. These are fundamental human instincts. For the 65,000 years that the world's oldest continuing living culture has occupied this continent, it's been rich with activity in many of these fields and many others besides. Secondly, it's an important part of our national identity that we have institutions recording our history, showcasing works of Australian artists, fostering study and appreciation of art and culture, which after all is a means of seeking to explain, interpret, understand and respond to the world in which we live. As Marilyn Darling has explained to me, in her advocacy for the founding of the National Portrait Gallery, she pointed out the importance of analogous galleries in Britain and the United States in contributing to national identity in those countries. As history records, the Howard government found this advocacy persuasive. The third reason for the support of the arts by coalition governments, is that we've responded to the support for and interest in the arts, which is widely shown by Australians. In 2019, 98% of Australians engaged with the arts by making art, listening to music, reading for pleasure, viewing, attending, or going online. Many of us are very actively engaged. In 2017-18, 31.4% of adult Australians participated in at least one cultural activity, such as playing music, singing, dancing, writing, sculpting, painting, or photography. A fourth and very important factor is the economic significance of the arts. This is always a risky argument to make as Arts Minister because it raises a suspicion that you are blind to the inherent value of artistic and cultural activity. But governments think in economic terms. We're interested in jobs generated and businesses supported and number of tourists attracted and the extent of capital investment stimulated. On all of these measures, the arts and entertainment sector carries serious weight. The cultural and creative sector made up $115.2 billion of economic activity in 2017-18, 6.3% of GDP. In 2016, 645,000 people, 6% of the total Australian workforce, were employed in the cultural and creative industries. Of these people, 32,000 were employed as creative artists, musicians, writers and performers, and as support staff in the performing arts. 16,000 were employed in galleries, libraries, archives and museums, and 49,000 were employed in the broadcasting, electronic or digital media and screen industries. As this breakdown of employment numbers suggests, the cultural and creative sector encompasses core arts and entertainment undertakings such as theatrical and musical performances, galleries, libraries and museums and film. It also encompasses related sectors such as publishing, television, architecture, fashion and software. Some of these sectors are government subsidised. Some operate on a for-profit basis in the marketplace. But of course, many people move freely between these different sectors, whether it's actors who appear in a Sydney Theatre Company play, but also in a Hollywood movie, directors who make TV commercials as well as movies supported by Screen Australia, or architects who move from designing houses to designing sets. This crossover between subsidised art forms and the commercial marketplace provides another important rationale for public funding of the arts, and I'll come back to this point a little later. Let me mention one particular case study of the economic importance of the arts, the link with tourism. We know that arts and culture are important draw cards for tourists, both Australians travelling domestically and also international visitors to Australia. The Australia Council looked at these issues in a recent report on arts tourism. It found that in 2018, there were 12.3 million day trips and 13.4 million overnight trips that included arts activities undertaken within Australia by Australians. It also found that arts tourists are high value tourists. Domestic arts tourists spent about $16 billion in 2018, while international arts tourists spent around $17 billion in 2017. It turns out that arts tourists travel further, stay longer, and spend more than the average tourist in Australia. What we also know is that arts tourism is growing, or at least it was before COVID, and I think we can be confident that in due course that growth will return. Arts tourism by international visitors increased by 47% between 2013 and 2017, compared to international tourist numbers overall, up by 37%. This is a good point to turn to discuss the severe impact of COVID on the arts and entertainment sector in Australia. When COVID hit and lockdowns began, the outcome was that venues were closed, performances were cancelled, and artists lost their gigs. Australia-wide lockdowns began on 14 March 2020, as Australia recorded its 100th case of the virus. By the week commencing 30 March, only 47% of businesses in the arts and recreation services sector were operating. The Morrison government moved quickly to support the arts and entertainment sector, including through making JobKeeper and JobSeeker available and through cash flow support to businesses in the arts sector. If we take the numbers from the start of the pandemic through to the end of December 2020, total JobKeeper payments to people employed in the creative and performing arts industry subdivision, to use the terminology of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, stood at over $731 million. In addition, some $119 million in cash flow boost credits went to 3,200 businesses in this subdivision. I mentioned earlier the myths which abound when it comes to arts funding. There has been plenty of myth making during COVID from our political opponents and the Media, Arts and Entertainment Alliance. They claimed, quite wrongly, that JobKeeper was not well designed for the arts sector and most people were not getting it. In fact, as at April 2020, around 2/3 of people employed in the creative and performing arts industry subdivision received JobKeeper. It frankly mystifies me that people who claim to be advocating for the interests of workers in the arts and entertainment sector should have occupied themselves in spreading fear and misinformation on this issue. Our government also moved quickly to provide funding designed to stimulate the restart of arts activity. In our view, this was the first best approach, so we could get people in the sector working again as soon as was practical. To provide payments to people in the sector while they were not working, while very much a necessity during the period that most activity was heavily restricted for public health reasons, was nevertheless a second best from an arts policy point of view. Again, this is an issue where we seem to have a clear difference of opinion from our political opponents. Our first package of $27 million was announced in early April, with an emphasis on Indigenous art and regional art. In June, we announced our $250 million COVID-19 Creative Economy Job Maker package. This included $75 million for the RISE Fund, Restart Investment to Sustain and Expand, intended to provide capital to help production and events businesses to stage new festivals, concerts, tours and events as social distancing restrictions eased. All $75 million has now been committed, supporting 176 different productions, shows and events around Australia, expected to be seen by 15 million Australians and to generate 64,000 jobs. The announcement in the Creative Economy package, the Job Maker package, also included the Show Starter Loan Scheme, $90 million in loans to be delivered by banks, but to be supported by 100% Commonwealth guarantee to assist arts and entertainment businesses adversely affected by COVID-19 to access finance for new productions and events. There was a $50 million temporary interruption fund administered by Screen Australia to support local film and television producers to secure finance and keep filming. This was necessary as filming of new productions had largely come to a halt because insurers would not provide coverage against key personnel on a film being unable to continue due to catching COVID. And without that insurance, screen financiers would not release funding for productions to go ahead. So far, over 40 productions have been able to commence with the support of that fund, generating over 11,000 jobs across every state and territory. The final element was the Sustainability Fund, $35 million to provide direct financial assistance to support significant Commonwealth-funded arts and culture organisations facing threats to their viability due to COVID. In July last year, we announced an additional $400 million for the location incentive, bringing total funding for this program to $540 million, with the objective of attracting large budget international film and television productions to Australia over the next 7 years. To date, 22 productions have been secured, generating 12,700 jobs and bringing in investment of over $1.66 billion. In September last year, we announced an additional $22.9 million to support Australia's national cultural institutions during COVID-19. In the October budget, we topped this up with a further $31.2 million for these institutions. Also part of the October budget were commitments to a further $33 million to Screen Australia to support the continued development and production of Australian screen content, and $20 million to the Australian Children's Television Foundation to further support quality Australian children's screen content. Just in the last month, we have added further funding for Australia's creative and cultural sector. The RISE Fund, as I mentioned, initially provided with $75 million when announced in June last year, has been increased by a further $125 million. This funding will support new or reimagined arts and entertainment events, including festivals, concerts and tours, as Australia's creative sector continues to bounce back from the impacts of COVID-19. We've also committed $20 million to support some 390 independent cinemas around the country. These businesses have been doing it pretty tough under COVID, with limits on how many patrons they can have in the cinema, as well as the delaying of new release films by major distributors. And I make the point again, all of this is on top of our business as usual funding of the arts sector in Australia, which stands at around $750 million a year. In fact, in the last 12 months, when you add up the business as usual funding, the $855 million in additional funding we've announced, and the $850 million provided to the creative and performing arts subsector through JobKeeper and cash flow support, you arrive at a figure for total Commonwealth support for the arts of nearly $2.5 billion. So when our political opponents trot out their usual myths about which side of politics really looks out for the arts, do not believe them. The level of funding committed to the arts by the Morrison government in 2020-21 has been unprecedented. Well, let me turn in the final part of my remarks tonight to speak about our priorities for the arts. I've already spoken of the key reasons why coalition governments strongly support the arts, and those reasons remain as valid today as they were in the days of Menzies, Holt and Gorton. But there are some additional factors worth highlighting as we see the arts sector increasingly heading on the path back to normality emerging from the challenge of COVID. And I hasten to add, we're not there yet, but we can certainly see the path in front of us. So against that backdrop, there are four key priorities I want to highlight. The importance of the arts being for all Australians, contestable and competitive funding, the arts and the knowledge economy, and Indigenous arts. Let me start then with the importance of the arts being for all Australians. What does it mean to say this? Some might reject this proposition, saying that it's code for abandoning the pursuit of excellence, or that our only guide in arts policy is being what is popular. Well, I don't think it means either of these things, but it does mean that there are some serious issues we need to consider. Much of our arts activity happens in the CBDs and inner city areas of our capital cities. Is this fair to the around 8 million residents of regional and remote Australia? Do our national companies tour enough? Are they seen often enough in our regional towns? An equally valid question is whether it is fair to the millions of residents of suburban Australia. Why do we not have major subsidised theatre companies or symphony orchestras or circus companies based in Blacktown or Liverpool or Penrith or Broadmeadows or Logan or Elizabeth or Rockingham? When the Prime Minister and I launched our creative economy package in June last year, we deliberately chose the new Sydney Coliseum Theatre in Rooty Hill in Sydney's west. The fact is that plenty of residents of suburban Australia are very interested in the arts and are keen to get along and see a show, as the multi-million-dollar decision to build that new theatre amply demonstrates. Now, this is not just my view. It's supported by research from arts think tank A New Approach in their recent report, A View from Middle Australia, Perceptions of Arts, Culture and Creativity. The report draws on 8 focus groups with participants described as Middle Australians based on income and mainly living in marginal electorates. The participants in those focus groups showed strong support for the importance of arts and culture. They saw arts and culture as playing a significant role in building community, defining identity, stimulating creativity, improving mental health, and enriching children's education. They expressed a preference for live performance and interactive participatory forms of arts and culture, such as community art and festivals. Interestingly, they reported that when the term arts was used by itself, they saw it as referring to high arts, aimed at a small elite group. But they saw the phrase arts and culture as referring to activities that are broadly accessible and important. Well, it sounds to me that Menzies, Holt and Gorton were onto something with their support for the arts, and showing an understanding of where Middle Australia sits on this issue. Now, this view of making the arts accessible has underpinned many of the choices in allocating funding under the RISE Fund. When my department has advised me to give $668,000 to a Lego display, $971,000 to Harry Potter the Stage Show in Melbourne, or $1.46 million to the Wood 40 Folk Festival in Southeast Queensland, I've been very happy to accept that advice. We're unapologetic about wanting to see arts and entertainment events reach out to the widest possible audiences. I should also emphasise the important role of the Creative Economy Task Force, which we established to advise the Morrison government on the recovery in the arts sector, including offering strategic advice on how we should use our funding commitments. The task force is chaired by the dynamic Lisanne McGregor, sadly soon to be lost to the Australian art scene after a highly impactful career heading the Museum of Contemporary Art. Her wise counsel and that of the other members of the task force, from Greta Bradman to Lee Shrin Sin to Rachel Healy and many others besides, has been of enormous value to me as Minister. Let me turn from accessibility to the arts to a related issue. How do we have an arts funding system which is contestable and competitive? It's not good enough to have a cosy club of arts companies which receive effectively guaranteed funding each year through the Australia Council. With such a large amount of taxpayers' money being spent on arts funding, it's a matter of simple fairness to ask where this money goes and who gets the benefit of it. I should here acknowledge the determined work of the Australia Council themselves to make the club a bit less cosy. In late 2019, we reached agreement amongst all arts ministers, Commonwealth and state and territory, to move away from the old system in which there were 29 companies designated as major performing arts companies, and it seemed impossible to add any more to the list. Under the new system, the so-called national partnership companies face a process every 4 years to stay on the list. And we have already added new companies to the list, such as the Brisbane-based contemporary circus company, Circa. In my view, there is more to do. Our arts funding arrangements reflect population distributions of 25 to 30 years ago. Sydney and Melbourne are overrepresented. Queensland and Western Australia are underrepresented. With our RISE funding, we've made some progress here, but we need our permanent arrangements, as opposed to the temporary COVID responsive arrangements, to be better aligned to our contemporary population distribution. There are even more challenging questions than these geographic ones. Who judges which art forms receive funding and which do not? More than one prominent Australian musician has said to me, why does classical music receive such a preponderance of funding in this country? Again, this is dangerous territory for an arts minister to wade into, and I confidently predict the word Philistine will be used by at least some in responding to me asking this question. But I don't think it's something we can ignore. Now, a third priority area, in my view, is the crossover between the arts and the knowledge economy, or the digital economy, choose your preferred jargon term. We know that new technologies are transforming the nature of work right across the economy. Employment in digital intensive industries has more than doubled over the past 30 years. Around 1 million Australian workers in 2016 had as their highest level of qualification one in a creative field. These included communication and media studies, graphic and design studies, visual arts and crafts and performing arts, information technology, including computer science and architecture. As the economy changes, routine work is being automated. More and more of us are likely to employ creative skills in our work. If you look at the last decade's fastest growing industries, around a quarter of those are employed in information, media and telecommunications, and a fifth of those employed in professional, scientific and technical services hold a formal a qualification in a creative skill. The skills that creatives use in the arts are skills of value across the modern economy. Just look at the career paths of people who train in publicly subsidised arts training institutions like the National Institute of Dramatic Art or the Australian Film, Television and Radio School. Many end up in the private sector, in the for-profit economy. One specific area of crossover is using broadband and digital networks to make arts content more widely available. While COVID has been a dark period for the arts, it has also stimulated much innovation in this area. many companies quickly turned to digital presentation methods, such as Australian Chamber Orchestra's ACO Virtual and Australian Brandenburg Orchestra's Brandenburg One Channel. Another good example is the Adelaide Festival, using a range of live capture and live stream productions. I met today with the founders of the Melbourne Digital Concert Hall. Under their model, developed by musicians for musicians, concerts are performed once at a set time, as is the traditional way in the music world. But what is not at all traditional is that the concert is streamed online. Concert goers purchase tickets in advance and the ticket money goes to the artists. This project generated $1.25 million for Australian musicians and arts sector workers in 2020. I'm pleased that we were able to support it with funding of $250,000 under RISE. An important aspect of all these projects is using technology to break down the divide I mentioned earlier, so that works are able to be seen not just in our capital cities, but also in regional and remote Australia. The final priority area I want to mention this evening is Indigenous art. The extraordinary creative talents of First Australians still do not receive the recognition they truly deserve. One of the most moving experiences I have had as Arts Minister was a visit to 4 remote Indigenous communities in the APY lands in the far north of South Australia in late 2019. I travelled with South Australian Premier and Arts Minister Stephen Marshall, long a champion of Indigenous art and artists. At Mimili, the artists explained to us the stories reflected in their striking paintings. Then they said, now we will dance it for you. And the same story was rendered in dance. In a remote community, in a fairly basic building with concrete floors, I was struck by the extraordinary and inherent creativity of the artists we met, founded in their deep knowledge of their culture and country. This year, the Indigenous Visual Arts Industry Support Program within my department will support more than 80 arts centres with funding of $22 million. This helps some 8,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to pursue professional art practice and employ 500 arts workers, most in remote or very remote communities. But I think we can do more. There are powerful artistic, cultural and economic reasons to further build the market for Indigenous art. And of course, this must include a strong focus on artists receiving a fair return for their work. Late last year, I joined with my friend and colleague Ken Wyatt, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, to announce that we wanted to develop a new Indigenous Visual Arts Action Plan to support Indigenous artists and their cultural and economic interests. We released a consultation paper in September, received submissions until the end of last year, and I was pleased to directly engage with quite a number of people in the Indigenous arts sector, including Indigenous artists, to get their perspectives. We're now digesting all of that input with a view to releasing the plan later this year. Let me conclude then by returning to the question with which I began. Why do we fund the arts? As I've argued, coalition governments have long funded the arts, and we've done so for very good reasons. COVID has hit the arts sector hard, and for that reason, we're providing unprecedented amounts of support on top of our considerable business as usual funding for the arts. But as well as funding, as the arts and entertainment sector recovers from COVID, we have the chance to reset elements of our approach to the arts. I've shown some of the ways that we've done this through making funding more contestable and through a willingness to go beyond the traditional kinds of art forms and companies which have tended to get most of the funding. Ultimately, the aim of the Morrison government is to make the arts accessible to all Australians and to leverage the distinctive strengths of Australia's artistic, cultural and entertainment sectors to make our country stronger economically and socially, as well, of course, as stronger culturally. We did not want to have a pandemic. I think that's a statement with which everybody would fiercely agree. But it has given an opportunity for a significant reimagining of the Commonwealth's approach to the arts. In my view, that reimagining will pay significant dividends for all Australians who love the arts, and on the evidence, that is the great majority of us. Thank you.
Many thanks, Minister, for a very comprehensive analysis with a fair bit of history in it, which was good to hear. Look, we'll come to questions and discussion. We've got around perhaps a little bit past the top of the hour if we have to go that long. Questions or comments briefly should be on broadly the topic of the talk, which covers the Minister's responsibility for communications and the arts. Can I just take you up on the interesting points you made about the governments of Robert Menzies and Harold Holt and John Gorton? It's good to see those figures. It seems to me there's a correlation here because there's, you call them your political opponents, say that coalition governments haven't funded the arts. There's another side to that, is there's a kind of mythology that Australia in the time of Menzies, Holt and Gorton was an intellectual desert. But if you look at what was produced in music and in art and in plays and books in that time, that's not the truth at all. So is there any way of getting out more the message about, as well as where who did the funding, the results of that funding?
Look, it's a very important point, Gerard, and while naturally as Arts Minister, a lot of what you talk about and think about is funding for the arts, ultimately we need to be very clear about what our objectives are here, which is artistic excellence, artistic accessibility, vigorous cultural activity. I think you're right. There is a myth. One of the myths that gets widely articulated is that we were some kind of cultural desert, but there was vibrant activity occurring through that period. Bearing in mind, of course, it was at the time a country with a population, a third to a half of what it is now. So as a country, we've grown very sharply in population. And what is very noticeable as Arts Minister, engaging with significant institutions in our different cities, and I touched on this point a little bit in talking about Western Australia and Queensland, you can see the scale of growth in Perth and in Brisbane and the Gold Coast over the last 20 to 30 years, and the way that's been reflected in the scale and the activity level of the major cultural institutions in those cities. Things like how long the season is, how many different productions there are in a season, the size of the theatres, the number of people, the size of audiences, and so on. So I think we've seen major growth in the scale of our arts activity, and in turn, that's been reflected in the excellence and the capability of Australian performers.
Thank you. Fred Chilton. Fred?
Thank you very much, Paul and Gerard. I was going to ask you about another route under the Blue Mountains, given what's happened to Bell's Line and the 9 hours it took us to get to Bathurst on Friday. But no, I wanted to comment on your point about the crossover between art and technology. And I think one of the really exciting things that's happened is the growth in Australian expertise in special effects and in post-production work. And I think that's something that your government deserves credit for encouraging, and it should be highlighted. And it creates lots of jobs, animation and so on. Look at Bluey, what a wonderful success it's been.
It's a powerful point, Fred, and you can look at businesses like Rising Sun Pictures in Adelaide, or Animal Logic, which have significant scale, and you're right to say major employers. It takes a lot of skill to be a professional animator and to have significant groups of people coming together, whether it's for animated productions or animated elements of special effects and so on. Takes significant skill, and it's a big global market. And we do have some very, very accomplished practitioners in Australia.
Dennis O'Day. Dennis? Anyone else wave your hand or let us know? Dennis? Where's Dennis gone? Dennis has disappeared. Right, so well, the minister gets it. Frank. If Dennis can hear me, let us know. Frank Conroy.
Thanks very much, Gerard. Minister, one of the things that intrigued me from your remarks was your wish, or the government's wish, to deepen down into the community with your funding. I'm down here in Bowral, and we have some very, very professional groups locally, although they're very much amateur. And I just wonder, how do you compare, say, a professional group in the city like the Ensemble Theatre to, say, a group out in regional areas?
Well, I think the starting point would be that in government funding of the arts, we are overwhelmingly providing support to professional companies and to people who are full-time professional artists and performers. And I do think that's important. We need to maintain standards of excellence. That being said, it's certainly a highly desirable thing that we have also a tradition of, enthusiastic amateur performance, and that's been part of Australian life for a long time. In my electorate, there are significant amateur organisations, the Ku-ring-gai Philharmonic Orchestra, the Ku-ring-gai Art Society, to mention two, and the standard of work delivered through those organisations is high, but they would very clearly say they're amateur organisations, and the musicians are all people who have full-time jobs doing other things. So I think it's appropriate that we draw a clear distinction between professional performers and artists and amateurs. In fact, I discussed this issue this morning with, I mentioned I met with the founders of Melbourne Digital Concert Hall, and one of their key principles, they set up very quickly, they got going within weeks of the lockdowns beginning in March last year. And they decided one of their key principles was you'd have to pay to see the show. That's a well-accepted principle if you go to a live event, and it should be no different online. And some of the enthusiastic commentary about the online availability of arts content during last year tended to gloss over that point, but it's a really important point. Professional artists deserve to be paid, and they stand or fall in the marketplace. And of course, if you go back to the history of most art forms, it's historically been highly commercial. Shakespeare was a businessman and quite a successful one. You can look at in the 19th century, but there's no shortage of examples. Anyway, in summary, we certainly want to celebrate and encourage amateur productions, but we also want to be very clear-minded in saying we want to have high-quality professional artists. People are prepared to pay decent ticket prices to go and see.
I suppose there's never enough money you can give the arts, but to what extent do you have some kind of autonomy? If you take the Sydney Writers' Festival, which is essentially funded by the New South Wales government, but there's a degree of funding from the Australia Council, which is not directly from the Commonwealth government, but the money is the Commonwealth government's money that it gives to the Australia Council. I understand the literary side of the Sydney Writers' Festival is very diverse and very good, but the political and social side of the Sydney Writers' Festival, funded all by taxpayers, including the City of Sydney. I mean, if there's a Conservative in that lot, it would be because they got lost in circular quay on the way to try and find the Liberal Party headquarters. It'd be an accident. I mean, it's an overwhelming left-wing sort of stack, and everyone agrees with everyone else. I mean, they've got a debate on where there are three people on each side of the debate of whether Australia is any good or not. You can't work out who's going to argue for the yes and who's going to argue for the no. So is there any way of sort of sending a polite note to the Australia Council that a degree of diversity in some of these literary festivals wouldn't do any harm?
one of the features of a number of parts of my portfolio is that significant amounts of funding are allocated on the basis that decisions are made by those to whom the funding is allocated at arm's length from the minister, indeed more than arm's length, a considerable chasm. And so, you know, a very strong principle when it comes to arts funding is that, or certainly in terms of the justification for the Australia Council, it's been that you've got an arm's length body making funding decisions, and you don't have ministers involved in making assessments of the artistic merits of particular projects. And of course, there's an analogy there with the funding principles for the ABC, where the ABC has editorial independence enshrined in its statute. So these are perennial issues, and there are certainly instances of things being done by artists who receive funding from the Australia Council that are absolutely not to my personal taste. But I think that principle that it's not what suits what appeals to a minister of the day personally that should get arts funding. I think that's a very important principle. Of course, I don't diminish the point that you make, Gerard, which is that you would get the impression from some arts events around the country that there is no artist or performer or writer anywhere in Australia who's ever voted Liberal. Now, I'm very confident that's actually not the case. And I suppose one of the points I've been seeking to make in my remarks tonight is assumptions about which way the arts sector aligns politically are not necessarily accurate. But I don't dismiss the force of the point that you make.
Anne.
Minister, this is probably a controversial one. A number of things that are funded by the government, like universities and whatever, have user pay schemes. Why is it that we have a public broadcaster with no input for those who want to watch it? I mean, if I never watch the ABC, I still have to pay for it. Why can't we have a scheme where at least something from taxpayers is put into our, by users, is put into our public broadcaster, as in Britain with some radio and TV fees or licenses or whatever it's called. But it does seem to me that we spend an awful lot of money on the ABC. We don't really increasingly, because of other forms of media, get a lot of value for money. And we make no input from the user.
As I understand the licence fee arrangements in the UK, or the way they've historically worked, because I think there's a process underway to look at reforming that, but in practical terms, unless you can demonstrate you don't have a television, you're up for the licence fee. So I'm not sure it's all that different in practical terms to our arrangement. In other words, funded out of the general tax base. Look, again, I understand the force of the argument. Against that, there are, as we know, a well-established set of arguments as to why there would be funding for a public broadcaster and why we do that, as is done in the UK and as is done in a range of other countries, as part of a more diverse media landscape. And our priority from a media policy perspective has been about preserving the diversity of that media landscape. We've had a lot to say about the challenge presented by the erosion of advertising revenue for the commercial broadcasters and newspapers as a consequence of the dominance of Facebook and Google And through the News Media Broadcasting Code, we've been able to bring about some pretty effective practical change in that regard by securing commitments, commercial agreements from Facebook and Google to be making payments to the commercial media businesses for content paid for and generated by those businesses, which then are used by the platforms to essentially attract eyeballs to their sites, which they then very successfully monetize. So I suppose my point would be our policy focus has been about maintaining the health of that mixed media landscape where the private advertising funded media outlets have a very important role to play in providing a diversity of opinion and perspective.
Okay, we've got time for 3 very short questions. So it'll be Ida Lichter and then Paul and then a final one. So Ida, quick comment.
Thank you very much, Minister. Regarding private versus public funding for the arts, what do you consider is a reasonable ratio?
Well, the great majority of organisations that are funded or receive government funding also earn revenue from ticket sales, many of them receive philanthropic support. One of the perverse outcomes of COVID has been that those organisations which have done best at what governments over decades have been encouraging them to do, that's to say, build up significant revenue streams other than government funding through ticket sales, through philanthropic support and so on. They're the ones that have been hit the hardest because the audiences overnight disappeared and for many months they had no ticket revenue. So that's one of the reasons, by the way, why we structured the Rise Fund the way we did, because what that meant was those organisations then were at risk of not being able to restart because the money they'd normally draw on, the capital cost of new productions, had been chewed up just sustaining themselves when they didn't have any revenue. So I think it's difficult to be prescriptive about an ideal mix, but I do strongly believe that we want arts companies to be obtaining a significant portion of their revenue in the marketplace from ticket sales, from subscriptions, so that they've got to go out and attract people with the quality of what they do.
Paul, I'm sorry, we won't be able to include you because we want to finish very close to the top of the hour. Finally, Minister, could you just tell us, the government, the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and yourself, very successful, it appears, with negotiating these arrangements with Facebook and Google. What's the background to all that?
About 3 years ago, then Treasurer Scott Morrison kicked off the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry. So this was a major piece of work to look at the impact of Google and Facebook on the media sector in Australia. And it was a piece of competition analysis. We asked our competition regulator to do this work. And when they reported to government in mid-2019, a multi-100-page report, very comprehensive, what they pointed out was the significant market power of Google and Facebook, particularly in digital advertising, the way that that was eroding the revenue streams of the media businesses, and that because of the substantial market power, the imbalance of bargaining power, that meant that Google and Facebook were able to use content generated and paid for by news media businesses, because it costs money to employ journalists and to apply editorial standards and check facts. Google and Facebook have been able to use that content without sitting down to have commercial negotiations about what they pay for it. And that's only possible because of that significant imbalance in bargaining power. So the ACCC recommended that the solution to that problem was that there ought to be a code regulating the terms, the commercial terms between a Google and a Facebook on the one hand and Australian news media businesses like a Seven West Media or a News Corp on the other. And very importantly, the use of codes to deal with imbalances in bargaining power is a well understood part of our competition policy approach in Australia. There are codes. There's a code dealing with the relationship between the supermarkets and their suppliers, recognising the concentration and the market power in the supermarket sector. And the other feature of what the ACCC recommended was that there should be a negotiate arbitrate model. That's to say, Google or Facebook to commercially negotiate with the news media businesses on what they would pay for the use of content. If that did not strike a deal, then compulsory arbitration. And again, that model widely used in sectors of the Australian economy, such as the telecommunications sector. So that's the model that's been put into law. The aim of it was to get commercial deals done as a first best, and it's had the impact that we hoped it would have. A significant number of deals done, continuing negotiations for others, and the consequence will be funding flowing into news media businesses, which in turn will enable them to commit more to journalism and deliver both the media policy outcome that we're seeking, as well as the competition policy outcome.
Many thanks and congratulations on that deal which you and others negotiated. I'll be very brief because we started a little bit late and I want to finish pretty well close to the top of the hour. Many thanks to Paul Fletcher. He's always been a great supporter of the Sydney Institute over the years. And as I said, he was going to come here last year. He couldn't make it for obvious reasons. And this is one of our earlier functions we're doing on Zoom. And we're very grateful that the Minister came along tonight and spoke with a good sense of history and a good sense of contemporary issues. And it'll make a good paper when it's published in the Sydney papers online. But for tonight, thanks for a great talk and a good discussion.